logical dynamics. And again, saluting Dale Hatfield, it's important to start with the engineering background. We have an all-star panel here. I believe everyone, with the exception of John, has been here before. John?
I did raise my hand to be one of the first-year ones, so thank you for that. Yeah, thank you for that applause.
You need to turn your mic on.
My mic, there you go, that'll help. So John is the Executive Vice President and Chief Network Officer at Comcast. Jack is his counterpart at Level 3, and it was fun because earlier they were acknowledging they had first met as technologists when they were working for several different companies ago. Ed Felten has been here many times before. He's now in the White House in the Office of Science Technology Policy. He has been a professor at Princeton. He has also been the first Chief Technology Officer at the Federal Trade Commission. So Casey Claffy is now, among other things, doing incredible work in internet measurement. She is the founder director of the Center for Applied Internet Data Analysis at the University of California, San Diego. And finally, Dave Clark, who needs no introduction. He is a internet pioneer and legend. And Dave got to call the order of our discussion, and starting from Larry, where we talked about this idea of multi-stakeholder processes, which are emergent, they are messier, but they're what we have. And I think Dave has said that the biggest internet, I'll call it coordination challenge right now, is around security. And one reason it's such a big challenge is the internet was not architected with security in mind. So we're trying to use these processes to patch it on to this network. With that, Dave, let me give you a chance to riff, and then others can join in, and we'll take the conversation from there.
Okay, thank you. Yes, I did want to talk about security. When he said it was on the agenda, I had this mild panic attack because, of course, I have a nice day-long talk I give, and I've boiled it down to an hour. And he said, why don't you do 5 minutes? And that's kind of a bit of a challenge. So, but let me point out 3 things at a very high level. The first one is security is a motherhood word that doesn't mean a damn thing. And until you actually explain what problem you're dealing with, you don't realize that maybe you don't want it. The second is the word internet is ill-defined. If security is ill-defined, internet is indefined. To an engineer, an internet is this very simple thing. It moves packets. You know, bytes go in here and they come out here. But to a user, the internet is the totality of the internet experience. It includes Facebook on top, and it includes Wi-Fi down below. And when you say the internet is insecure, you have to be very careful. What did you mean? And the third thing, and excuse me, sir, but I'm going to push back on you. When you say the internet was not designed with security in mind, we thought very hard about security in the 1970s and the 1980s. There were things we knew we couldn't do then. For example, we knew we couldn't do encryption in software. We got a lot of advice about security. In fact, most of the advice we got from security was from NSA. And at the time, they were not concerned about impairment of their ability to do signals intelligence. They wanted a secure net. They were giving us a lot of good advice about how to do it. So it's not as if we didn't think about it. The thing we got wrong is that when we took the word security and we tried to reduce it to practice, we didn't understand what problem we were trying to solve. And it only slowly came into focus. So let me give you a sort of an engineer's partitioning of the security space. And I'll just point out in passing that's not the right way to do it. But here's an engineer's partitioning of the internet security space. The first problem is you and I are trying to have a conversation and somebody attacks us. Problem 1. Problem 2, you attack me. Okay. Problem 3, one part of the network attacks another, which happens all the time. And problem 4, which I'm not going to talk about, is denial of service attacks, which could have been put in one of those other categories, but it's not worth doing. So let's talk about the classic problem is you and I are trying to have a conversation and somebody attacks us. The conception that NSA gave us at the time is, well, what they're really worried about is disclosure control, confidentiality. So they said, well, we'll encrypt everything, but of course we can't do it in hardware, so we can't do it in software, so we have to do it in hardware. It's a real constraint. Their entire focus was on disclosure control. And one of the things they very clearly said is if there's something going on, stop the net. Availability was completely secondary. But there's a traditional triad in security of confidentiality, integrity, and availability. I actually hate that taxonomy, but they left availability out. So what happens today? You get this obscure box on your screen that says, you may be under attack. There's something weird about a certificate that I've explained to you in a way you can't possibly understand. Would you like to stop? Right? You know, no, I'm trying to get something done. So what do? You click yes, and then you die. But the point is, what users need is availability, and that is an identified component of security as it is traditionally taught. But let me point out, encrypting everything has nothing to do with availability. Okay? Now, what did we get wrong with our encryption schemes? Did we use bad algorithms? Well, if you talk to somebody who actually does counterintelligence, they'll say, amateurs think you break the algorithm, professionals just steal the keys. Okay. And what we got wrong in the space of protecting secure communication is the strategy we use for distributing keys. Now, it's not because we didn't think about it. In fact, this is not the early internet, it's fairly recent stuff. The certificate authority hierarchy is misdesigned, and the reason it is misdesigned is not because it's technically wrong, but because the guys who designed it, they probably were guys, were engineers. And if I can say something snarky about engineers, since I am one, if you're trying to build a socio-technical system which takes into account a deep understanding of human behavior, why would you hire an engineer? Sorry. What they failed to think through was all. What they failed to think through is that they were designing a system which, by definition, contained untrustworthy elements. Okay? There are certificate authorities which are, by virtue of the design of the system, allowed to make an utterance about any secure website, which are operated by countries whose interests are adverse to ours, like China. And in fact, Google, we had what used to call state-on-state action. We had a Google on China action, where China issued a certificate that said, no, Facebook, YouTube is not over there. YouTube's over there. Okay, the Chinese just did it. Okay, attribution. We said hard to add. No, the Chinese state did it. Okay, so Google declared China untrustworthy. Now, in that space, you're going to solve a problem with technology. You're going to solve a problem by thinking through how to manage trust. Let me give you another example, which is you attack me. NSA, again, had a very simple model. They had two simple assumptions, and one of them was, when you know somebody is untrustworthy and might attack you, what you want to do is keep them from talking to you. And actually, that's fairly easy to do. But if you think about the real world, that's not how the real world works. If you refuse to talk to anybody unless you knew you totally trusted them, you're a sociopath, right? And almost everything we do in the real world involves dealing with people about whom we cannot have a total assurance of trust. And when you buy a house, you do not go to Starbucks with a bag of money and take a piece of paper in exchange that may or may not be a valid deed. The transaction is highly constrained. You use notaries and escrow services and deed registries, so that even if the actors are not trustworthy, the transaction is trustworthy. Okay. On the internet, we engage with people we don't trust all the time. You probably all still receive email, even though you know that it might be spam, it might have a malicious attachment, it might be malware, you may be a phishing attack. You go to websites even though you know, or you should know, that it may load malicious software onto your computer, but you do it anyway. You engage in risky behavior because it's worthwhile, the risk is worthwhile. And that's not something we really understood how to think about back then. And again, encryption doesn't help. Encryption is not pixie dust that you sprinkle on this problem to make it go away. You know, having an encrypted conversation with somebody you don't trust is like meeting a stranger in a dark alley, right? You know, there are no witnesses and there's nobody to help. So where do these constraints come from that make a transaction trustworthy? They're not going to come from the internet, narrowly defined as the service that moves packets. It has no idea what you're doing. It was designed that way. Saying you want the internet as a packet transport mechanism to prevent bad behaviors, like saying, by the way, build me a highway system that can identify and block getaway cars, but by the way, we don't know what a getaway car is, right? You know, so you just can't do it. Where the constraints have to come from is the applications. So let's talk about applications for a minute on the internet. They are insecure by design. And let's just step up and admit what we did. Applications on the internet facilitate risky behavior, okay? In the beginning, the web downloaded some text to you and then we formatted on your screen. It was pretty benign. That's how much can I hurt you by sending you some ASCII. And then somebody said, let's add active code to the thing that's downloaded. Java, JavaScript, Flash, all that kind of stuff. Was the security community unaware of what this meant? No. Every security person I knew was standing on the sideline saying, this is the stupidest idea I've ever heard. You're all going to die. You're all going to die. You're all going to die. Okay? And what did the advocates say? Oh, if I download Flash, I can have animated dancing cats. And features trump security until you die. Okay? So let's just think about this for a minute. We tell our kids, never take candy from a stranger. Why would you take JavaScript from a stranger and put it on your computer and run it? Okay? You do it every day. Okay? Now, all I'm pointing out is when the correct operation of the system includes, by design, untrustworthy actions, then you can't complain about the fact that when you used the system as it was designed by people who knew what they're doing, you got in trouble. So we have to go back to the application designers who, by one definition, are outside the internet, by another definition, they're inside, and say, by the way, you need to learn some new design methods. And let me just hint at a design method, which is I engage in constraint-free behavior with people I trust. I engage in highly constrained behavior with people I don't trust. That's a useful way to modulate the behavior of the internet at the application layer, but we haven't tutored application designers to think that way. We could do that. The other thing we can do is we can go to the operating system designers who now understand that they have a problem they didn't realize they had before, which is to add stuff to the operating system to create what I might call the web equivalent of safe sex. How do you run risky code on your machine and then make sure it actually didn't do any harm? It's called sandboxing, among other things. And the point is, as you look at these various risks that I'm talking about, you can begin to see where the responsibility lies. And in most cases, it's not the packet layer of the internet. Now, that's insecure too, and we know exactly what the issues are there, and the reason why it's hard to secure it is, again, not because we don't understand this technical solution, but because we misunderstood the larger socio-technical space. It is a space of industry coordination. It is a space of misaligned incentives. I'm going to let some other people talk, but I just want to point out there's an exercise that you can all watch over the next few years, because we have a new buzzword on the horizon now, which is Internet of Things. And you asked about coming technology. Well, Internet of Things is not a new technology. It's just a rebranding. It's a new buzzword. Before that, it was sensor nets, and before that, it was actuators. But the point is, let's watch the IoT people grapple with features versus security versus cost reduction in that ecosystem. And we've been looking at architectures of Internet of Things, and by the way, most of them say, oh yes, we've solved the security problem. I've been looking at the websites, and they say, we've solved the security problem, blah, 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 encryption, blah, 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 blah. No, it's a system design problem. It involves understanding the incentives of all the actors in the ecosystem. And I bet you they vote for cost. I bet you they vote for features. I bet you they do it intentionally. And then we'll have a mess to clean up, and everybody will tell us, why didn't you think about security in the beginning? I'm off. Okay.
So one of the industry structure connections, I'm going to take this to Jack Waters next, is the old AT&T as a monopoly, when it wanted to introduce a new technology, say SS7, it could do so because it had real control of the whole system. Part of the challenge of the internet environment, where you've got these interconnected, interoperable network of networks, is building compatible security solutions is really hard. Jack, that's your world. As you hear Dave's, you could say rant, you could say warning, or you could say intelligent thoughts. What does that trigger for you?
Of course, they're intelligent thoughts. As an operator, it's a great description because it's kind of hard to grapple with all of that, right? We're the highway guys. We're the ones that build the road, and I like the analogy of the getaway car because that is kind of the problem. The one thing I'd say the internet has done for us that we take advantage every day is this notion of you need at least one public address to be able to communicate. And that, at the root of an operator, is the issue. That, as an operator, we really deal with two security things: data loss and services disruption. service disruption gets a lot of press at times. Data loss actually gets more press. You think about Home Depot and Sony, and I can't even remember the latest one, the healthcare and data loss.
U.S. government.
U.S. government. There you go. How many people got an OMB letter? Yeah, really nice, huh? That's 20 years, 30 years in the making. I think it was 1986. If you applied for a security clearance or applied for a job in the U.S. government in the last 30 years, you got a letter from the OMB saying you've been hacked. So really nice. Thanks a lot. You know, as an operator, I think these standards are tough. It's rooted in that I need at least one public address. For our customers, we worry about every day. We don't do as well on data loss. We do really well on service disruption. And I think there's more and more technology that's being deployed that lets us get better at it. The Internet of Things, I kind of agree. It's a bit of a buzzword. Think of it this way: it's more places that can attack you, and that's really going to be the issue that I think folks are going to have to deal with.
Maybe to add on to Jack's comments, if I could, and I think, Dave, you framed it very well. You know, there is no silver bullet, right? So that's something that I think the group needs to think about. The other thing that we think about, and certainly I spend a lot of time on that's important, is the complexity and velocity that these things go on. So it's at the speed of software. If you could kind of keep that, you know, in mind, I think it's important, because when you think you have a solution, that solution has some sort of shelf life, and then there's things that happen that do that. How many folks in the room, just as a use case, because one of the things that I think is interesting about cybersecurity is it has been a big business and it continues to be a big business. And it's probably at the data loss part that Jack was talking about in the application piece. How many in the room know what bot herding is? A couple. So this is an interesting use case. It's one of hundreds of thousands of use cases. But picture yourself as a bad actor in the dark space who wants to be a bot herder. And this is, you know, maybe appropriate sitting here in Boulder in Colorado. What a beautiful place. So thanks for having me. But what a bot herder does is basically uses techniques to have you click on things like David described, to plant malware on your PC. And once they plant that malware on your PC, it's effectively stealthy. It's not easily detectable in any, you know, running lists of applications or tasks. Every hour or so, it chirps out to its home base and says, hey, I'm here, I'm here. And someone who's a bot herder basically spends their days and nights actually gathering as many PCs or devices as they can, and ultimately, in background, they have control of that PC, although they're stealthy and no one really knows that. So, you know, real pros will effectively herd millions of devices, and then someone who is another dark space actor decides, I'd like to, you know, perhaps do a DDoS attack on someone, or I'd like to start a spam campaign. So you go to a bot herder, and in fact, you pay a certain amount of money for maybe 100,000 devices that this bot herder has control of. And in fact, at that point, you're given 100,000 IP addresses. You're given the keys to unlock this malware that's sitting on that PC, and there's a monetary exchange. So this is kind of one of literally hundreds of thousands of use cases that I think amplifies and at least brings texture to these kinds of things and in a real business model, not just in technology and what happens.
And they do take credit cards.
They do.
So Ed, we are fortunate as a nation to have a technologist of your capability looking at these challenges. They're not easy to resolve for government, but from the perspective of public policy, what are the levers, what are the strategies? Larry talked about the multi-stakeholder effort to help raise the effectiveness across an industry where we're up against some pretty formidable barriers.
Sure. Well, one thing we need to do as well is raise our effectiveness as a government at protecting the data that we have about citizens and the systems that we operate.
You got one of those letters too, huh?
I got one of those letters too. Just before I joined the government, as it turned out. And that's an important thing to do, and that's primarily about management and resources and how we organize ourselves. In terms of the big picture of how to improve the security of the ecosystem, I think I'll echo some of what has been said here, that the problem is less a problem of insecurity in the network itself, and it is more about the devices that we connect to the network, and specifically the software that's in those devices. Certainly there are many of the levers of government that we can try to bring to bear on that. But there are at least two grand challenges that make this a very difficult problem. And grand challenge number one has to do with the difficulty of securing very large, complex software. There are rules of thumb about how many bugs you can expect in a big software system, and some people say it's 1 bug per 1,000 lines of code. Some say 1 per 10,000 lines of code. And that doesn't give you a lot of comfort when you're talking about a system that has 100 million or more lines of code, like, say, a car or a smartphone or a computer. So just the inherent problem of securely engineering a very large, very complex system, that is a grand challenge, and it requires some fundamental engineering advances. And that's something that that R&D needs to, we need R&D, better R&D to work on. So that's problem number one. Problem number two has to do with the tension between a culture of safety and the sort of entrepreneurial move fast and break things culture. If you look at some sectors, some people point to, say, the aviation sector, where the odds of an accident on a commercial flight are well below 1 in a million, which is a really amazing fact, considering the inherent difficulty of keeping a big piece of metal in the air and flying through weather and all of that. And yet, the engineering culture, the institutional culture in the aviation sector is really pretty remarkable. Not perfect, but pretty remarkable to get there. And so can we get there in the software industry? Can we get there in places where people are building software to put into all of these devices? Certainly, the culture might be different. But we know that to engineer these things to a very high degree of assurance is very expensive and takes a lot of time given the current engineering trade-offs. And that so much of the benefit that comes from the digital world comes from the fact that people are moving very quickly, they're experimenting, they're putting out a minimum viable product and then iterating. We don't really understand, I think, fundamentally how to have those things at the same time. How to have the safety culture where it's needed, and at the same time have the entrepreneurial sort of cowboy culture, which has provided a lot of the value in the software world.
And that's a related trade-off to what Dave mentioned, which is of functions. People want the features, they want it to work,
Sure.
versus security. Now, Casey, I want to bring in the conversation and pivot a little bit. One of the areas you focused a lot, I sort of previewed, is on understanding this network of networks and what is happening. One of the challenges for policy is that as you have a network of networks, interconnected system, it's harder to get your arms around it than if you had one company, AT&T, running it all. So you are, maybe, there you go. You could have a really incompetent company, which might be worse. But we are in this system today where you've got tons of different traffic, tons of different actors proliferating. How do you begin to think about understanding what's going on in the network and what management practices and culture is appropriate?
Well, actually, I think a lot of the security problems you have today are not, or historically in the last 30 years, let's say, are not so much because there's
Your mic. Your mic on?
Is it on?
It's on. It's just.
It is
It's
on.
on. Can you move it closer?
Hello? Okay, let me put it up here. Hello, testing, okay. I would go at it from the other direction. A lot of the problems I think you have today are not because there's a proliferation of many different networks, but there's a monopoly on software, on the devices that we use. So there's strong incentive to develop malware for devices, or for a system where you have a lot of access to bots if you end up writing malware that can compromise them. And that's actually a legal circumstance, not a technological circumstance. And indeed, I would say that a lot of the other dimensions of our lack of security or our problems with security are the result of legal instruments or legal conditions rather than technological conditions. I mean, obviously, we're using an architecture, a set of protocols that were designed for basically a trusted environment. And so we're going to have issues when we use them in a world where parties don't trust each other. That's obviously an incongruity that we have to contend with, but you know, we continue to see monopolies on the devices that we use, software monopolies on the devices we use. We also continue to see shrink wrap, indemnificate. We see proprietary licenses on software, so even if you detected a bug, you couldn't fix it because you couldn't get access to the software. And that's a legal instrument that makes us less secure, not a technology condition. And third, you also sign off a lot of your ability to do anything about problems that happen with software because of the indemnification clauses in these proprietary software licenses. So that's yet another legal instrument that makes us less secure and prevents us from trying to improve security in the large. And then, of course, I don't really understand how we can make the case that any given policy we have on security is improving security because we don't really know. And this gets to the proliferation of networks that are out there. We don't really know even what sort of security events are happening inside companies or other agencies unless it gets on the front page of the news. So we only recently have mandatory reporting requirements for data breaches in all 50 states. I mean, it took a while, but now I think we have them in all 50 states, do we? Most of them, if not all. But that's one narrow slice of security breaches. We don't have any sort of mandatory reporting for other types of security events that happen in companies, like none. It's not like the airline industry, and I don't think this is sort of a culture that emerged voluntarily by the engineers. There's a tremendous amount of regulation and reporting of incidents that is why we don't fall out of the sky anymore. And same thing with building codes. If we had building codes the way we have software codes, we would all be dead, literally.
Yeah.
So it's just, and that's all legal stuff. So I don't mean to blame you guys, but I'll just say there's an opportunity here. And we won't get security. We won't become more secure until lawyers and the people that pay them do things quite differently from the way they've been doing them for the last 30 years with respect to the software industry.
So, Dave, let me go to you and talk a little bit about a institutional challenge, back to what Larry was talking about, of how do you integrate legal-ish institutional processes with engineering knowledge, because part of the disconnect that Casey's hitting is that many lawyers are intimidated because they don't want to screw this up, but they also realize there's this challenge. And so one attraction of this multi-stakeholder group processes, if you give a broad charge to a group to develop whatever network management practices or security practices, you might create the space for problem solving, like Larry Strickling. I know you've been involved in BTAG, one such effort. What are your thoughts on that institutional strategy as a way to go at some of these problems?
Well, a lot of the problems we're dealing with are problems of coordination and incentive. And conversations like that can facilitate coordination, but they do not automatically solve the incentive problem. And there's a fundamental conundrum. And again, it relates to the willingness to use regulation to impose a uniform burden on people. If I'm developing software and I am a little slower to market because I put a little more effort into making it secure, then since my product dies in the marketplace, the effort is completely dissipated. So what you have to do now to succeed in this space, because there is no, it's sort of a race to the bottom in the sense, the quickest, crappiest code is the stuff that makes it in the marketplace, and then definitionally, you're coming along afterwards and trying to clean the mess up. But otherwise, you would have died, so it doesn't make any difference. That's the better outcome of the two. And so when we look at some of the problems that involve coordination, like how do you improve the posture of the routing protocols in the interdomain routing protocols in the internet, BGP, or how do you deal with the coordination problems to clean up the mess we have with the certificate authority hierarchy? There are a lot of actors that might do something. There are a lot of actors that might do something if only they knew this other guy was going to do something as well, but how did I know this other guy is going to do it? And of course, I'm going to make a sort of a nasty joke about my security friends. I wouldn't call them disagreeable, but they love to disagree. And the reason that they do this is that they differ subtly in their interpretation of what the problem is you're trying to solve. So if you look at the problem I didn't talk about, which is securing the interdomain routing protocols in the internet, which is secure BGP or something like that, I once went out and I found I think, 9 scholarly papers that proposed 9 variants or 9 alternative ways to do this. And every one of those papers, of course, from an academic perspective, got you your Dewey little journal article and took you one step towards your tenure. But there's no place where you can go and say, well, okay, so how are we going to get together and coordinate this? How are we going to decide which one to do? And you know, I'm going to use an analogy that may offend some people, but the Manhattan Project was a bunch of people who were paid to agree. They said, we're going to solve a problem, okay? And I'm going to pay you to agree. And if there's somebody in the room who just isn't on the agenda, just, you know. And in fact, they tried 3 different things to try to get there. But part of what we have to do in the security space is find a venue not for a nice multi-stakeholder conversation, because I love that, but that's step 1, where step 2 is, okay, by the way, how are we going to decide which way to go, and how are we going to incentivize everybody to do it, and how am I going to make sure if I agree to do my part that he's going to do his part? And, you know, as somebody once said, you know, if you're lost in the woods, you can sometimes get out by walking either north or south. Both will work, but going in circles is stupid. And, and so it's a question of how do you get what I would call assured leadership in a multi-stakeholder space. And a long time ago about the internet, I said something, and I didn't mean it as a compliment. I said, we reject kings, presidents, and voting. And what I meant by that was whenever somebody stands up and says, well, let me lead, we kill them prophylactically because we don't trust anybody who stands up because we assume if you choose to lead, you must be corrupt. And it's just a libertarian, visceral reaction. So when you look at something like multi-stakeholderism, the real question is how do you marry that with a framework in which people say, okay, but at some point we have to agree, and we have to decide whether we're going to march north or south. And by the way, marching north may cost you more money, and marching south may cost him more money, but I'm in charge here, so we're going to take a decision.
But, sorry, I don't need to ask a question because I think it's an intriguing point. I do think that the system lacks incentive.
Yeah.
The system lacks incentive. Whose incentive is it? Is it one group? Is it multiple groups? Is it application software writers? Is it the enterprise that buys those applications? Is it the operator? The system really, really lacks incentive to solve the problem.
So the other thing I want to get to, and then add a point here, and just a shout out for Blake and Paul Ohm, who are working on cataloging this. I've heard the number, and it's different, although I think someone said it was 24 different federal agencies are looking at regulating software code that bears on the Internet of Things. So we've heard about the FDA medical apps, the National Highway Safety Traffic Association, connected cars, et cetera, et cetera. So we have 2 different problems, Dave. One is who makes the decision, and then what if it's too many people making too many decisions with too little information? Again, if I could just say Ed Felten makes the decision, I'd feel better about this. Government doesn't quite work this way. So, Ed, what do you think in terms of the institutional rubber hitting the road on this?
Sure. Well, it is the case right now that the various authorities that exist related to regulation here tend to be sectoral, right? And they tend to be driven by the fact that historically the challenges in regulating automobile safety are different than the challenges in some other sector, and so on. And as you have software coming into all of these places, you see, I think, more commonality across these different sectors, and commonality that's sort of technical in nature. But the fact that you have all of these different authorities and all these different agencies operating is not something that can be changed by executive order, right? It would require a lot of work, and a lot of work across the legislative, and a lot of work with the legislative branch as well, to get to a point where you have a more unified approach. Alternatively, the approach you have is one of coordination and making sure that the different sectors, the different agencies, use their different authorities in a way that is more coordinated. And that is a thing that you can do within the current structure, and it is a thing that is happening to some extent, I think an increasing extent, within government. But it's a difficult challenge for a bunch of reasons, right? One is the fragmentation makes it difficult to put enough of the right kind of technical expertise on each of these 20, what did you say, 20?
24 is the number I say, but
Whatever the number
directionally
is,
correct.
that sounds about right. It becomes difficult to have the right kind of expertise on each of these 24 different regulatory regimes or agencies.
And how many agencies have like a chief technology officer now, do you say?
Many of them do. Many of them do. And that certainly has been a trend, and I think one of the big positive things that the current administration has done is to increase the technical capability and the number of skilled engineers working in the policy parts of the government. We have a ways to go on that, but I don't think we are where we would like to be. And we need to make the best use of the people we have. But that will be an ongoing challenge.
You know, there are a number of recent, multi-dimensional tools that have come together, like I think the NIST framework was referred to. And, there's a great example of bringing together the ecosystem, a public-private partnership, and it's a framework that can be applied to systems, regardless of which industry they're in. So, there's an example of some recent work that I think has been, a great way to think about this. And then as an enterprise, right, prioritizing that and implementing. I think some of the things that perhaps Dave was hitting on is a little bit, cultural, and making sure that you have an elevated senior person in the company who basically lives and thinks about cyber every day. So the conversation does happen day one. And it is a balance a little bit of this convenience versus speed. But I think a lot of folks are responding to that, and they're using things like this multifaceted NIST framework to actually implement in their enterprise and also be helpful in protecting their customers.
And on the incentive front, David, there are different moves happening. It's still pretty nascent, but the Securities and Exchange Commission is asking for more disclosure and accountability by companies when they do have things go wrong, along with the points that Casey mentioned. One more point I want to ask John, and then ask Casey the same point, which is, as you get more devices on the network, we're talking about IoT, another piece of this, Internet of Things, is the bandwidth demands that keep scaling up. And you and Jack are in the business of having to scale up bandwidth. How do we look ahead and see where bandwidth is going given the demands, and how do you as a company keep provisioning more and more bandwidth?
That's great. So maybe I'll start with a little bit of a view from CES, because this is a bit of an explosion of Internet of Things. How many folks in the room went to CES and saw all that? So, obviously a great show, 170,000 folks across the entire ecosystem, consumer electronics, companies, operators, content owners, content distributors. And I think, at least for me, when we look at this, innovation is great. And when I see Internet of Things and CES, the first thing I think of is connected devices, and every one of them is going to generate traffic. So what does that mean? So it's a big deal. And I would say in our network and most networks, I'm not sure of Jack's, I think, you plan for literally a 50% capacity increase in 18 to 24 months. And, that's just a thirst for bandwidth. And I guess one of the conclusions is, the thirst for entertainment and information is unquenchable. So this is something where I think that trend will continue. It has as long as some of us have been doing this. And I think, one attack vector on that is to continually build capacity. I think we've done that. And that's an important part of servicing customers, servicing these apps, machine to machine, and all of those capabilities. But in the last few years, I think it's more than just building capacity, and it's making your network smarter. And we've done a bunch of things in the last couple of years and investments to not only build capacity, but to make the network smarter. And some of those things include like building a richer edge closer to our customers, which makes the delivery of content closer, and it makes videos start faster, and it reduces latency for gaming. We've deployed IPv6 across our entire infrastructure and may have one of the largest IPv6 active bases of addresses in the internet, and that's to help with all these connected devices. More recently, with a lot of our cloud-based services, we've made the network have embedded infrastructure and cloud services. So we think of the network as more than a pipe. The network is a fabric of connectivity, compute, storage with a security wrapper. And our ability nowadays to program the network to spin up virtual machines, storage, a connectivity profile with a security wrapper, through the work that we've done with OpenStack, which is an open source tool for orchestration, and we're really proud that we've contributed back about 37,000 lines of code, in that open source to allow others to do the same kind of orchestration. It lets us spin up resources and infrastructure in minutes instead of months. So it's a little less physical. It's now programming the network and making it smarter. We're doing a lot of things around smart energy. We've done a lot around our data centers and making sure that free air cooling happens wherever it can, or smart energy management in the data center, so cycling air conditioning units only happen individually, never together, to increase the peak spike. We've also done some things around fuel cells. We're thinking about things where, in fact, we'll start to power some of our facilities, and we have one in Connecticut that's powered by a fuel cell instead of the grid, and the grid is backup, which is kind of reverse thinking to the past. So there's a whole gamut of things around building smarter networks. We've just gotten started in the last couple of years, but there is a lot more to do in this journey in terms of how to handle this capacity, how to handle these great experiences in Internet of Things, and make sure that the network is thought of as a smarter entity and participating in cooperative and the best way to distribute content, the best way to enable experiences.
Jack, do you want anything to that?
We, I think our growth rate's similar. By the way, I'm sure that was 37,000 lines of secure code, right?
Totally, totally,
yeah,
up front.
With
Want
no
to
bugs.
make
Exception
sure
of that crappy quick code thing. We try not to do that.
I think we're all seeing the same thing. I was with one of our optics vendors, and we overshot our forecast by 50% this year. We never do that. Literally, we are connecting 100 gig pipes faster than we ever imagined right now. We're building more fiber than we have in 10 years. So, I mean, we're off really feeling the pinch for infrastructure. Customer demand is there. And I know everyone counts there's 5 companies in the world that are growing, the web scale guys, as they're called. It's more than that, though. It really is. And we're seeing demand from them, but also from large enterprise, from banking, from government, from you name it. There is an incredible amount of demand right now. And I think we see probably a little bit, 40 or so % a year kind of growth rate. So it's a pretty interesting time for network providers.
Casey?
Can I blame the lawyers again?
Please. That's why I
I
started
don't
engineers.
think we have a bandwidth crisis. I think we have a policy crisis that has manufactured a bandwidth crisis, because most of that upgrade you had to do to move that new data around is streaming video data by Netflix and YouTube, and the reason it's being streamed is copyright. If it could be preloaded at night when there's no bandwidth, many of those movies would still get watched when the user wants to watch them. Now, there's still some stuff that needs to be live streamed, presidential debates and football, but a lot of the traffic that goes across these links that are now causing all this stress about interconnection and congestion, I think it's really about copyright. And I'm not saying, I know Dave's going to slightly disagree with me here, I think, but.
Well, I think that there are many companies that have different ways of handling that, right? So it's not just Netflix. It's some people do preload. A lot of the satellite providers preload. So it's not. I wouldn't say that it's only that.
I think that's a lot.
And I wasn't necessarily implying there's a crisis. I don't think there's a crisis, but this growth in bandwidth of 50%, 40% CAGR over the years has been around for a long, long time. And I think if you do preload some content, for some period of time, I think you decrease that growth curve for a little bit. But when we go back to Internet of Things,
Right.
and video is a killer app, that there's going to be more and more traffic. And I think we just have to plan for it, right? And my suggestion was that we be smarter about how we distribute it. We don't just build bigger pipes.
And also spectrum policy. I think, and Larry talked about that a lot today, about what the government is trying to do to prepare for that.
But I think it's important to point out that if demand is growing 40% a year, that's an exponential. That's
Yes,
exponential
absolutely.
growth. We cannot free up spectrum exponentially.
Right.
The only response to exponential demand is to find a response that is in itself exponential. Now, you guys, by simply spending capital, can actually deal with exponential growth. I would leap to your defense and point out it actually does cost you money to do that, right? So I don't mind saying that.
But there's MIMO, too.
That's
Small cells.
no, sorry.
Not mine.
Not,
Small cells.
the only exponential response I know in the wireless space is small cells, because you can build exponentially smaller cells over time. But which means in the end, the wireless community is a wireline community.
It is
Well, and
absolutely
and you
that.
guys who have the
That's
wireline-
It's a
correct.
great tool, and I believe in it, but eventually it connects to something, the backhaul.
Next to something.
That's right. And you know, when BT decided to get back into the, you know, they, a while ago for regulatory reasons, they got rid of their mobile, but now they bought a mobile. You know, I said, well, what are you going to do? And they said, well, we realized that the real cost was cell sites and backhaul, and we own the backhaul, so we can do it. So the future of wireless is wired.
Correct.
And you know, you can do anything the last 100 feet. I don't give a
I would say another thing about
Go
I
ahead,
would say another
Jason.
thing about the IoT world, which is to the extent that the IP architecture is not a good fit for the wired world that we're using today, it's a much worse fit for the IoT world. I mean, we didn't cover this in the security section, but you know, arguably the biggest vector of attack on the internet is the fact that you can put a fake source IP address into a packet, and there's really no accountability. There's no way to trace back an attack.
Right.
And this is a vulnerability that's been known forever. I mean, it was there day one, and the internet doesn't use, the routers don't use the source address. They just use the destination address. So it's no skin off their back if the source address is fake. The only problem is if you ever have to trace back an attack to the original source, it becomes essentially intractable. If you have some number of ISPs in the way that you have to trace back router by router, where the routers are doing hundreds of millions of packets a second. So one, you can put a fake source address. Two, we're out of addresses anyway, as Jack mentioned. We're out of addresses for the wired internet. So now people are doing a bit of buying and selling addresses in the black market. There's no regulation of that. There's no transparency.
It's not black market, by the way.
Some of it's black. A lot of it's black market. We don't know. You can do it in the open if you want, but there's some evidence that a lot more of it is happening in the black market. And in any event, it's not regulated. There's no registry where I can be guaranteed to know if I have an IP address who owns it. So that makes a problem. And then think about that when it can be anything. So now we don't have enough IP addresses for the Internet of Things. But when you think about the attack surface, like if you use private addresses or IPv6, let's pretend, if there's now any device like my shoe can attack me with a fake source address, how am I going to trace it back?
So my last question, then I get to the audience, and I'll start with Ed, is IP addresses are international, and so we talked before about ICANN and Larry's work there. If we wanted to have the sort of accountability that Casey's talking about, that there'd be some registry for IP addresses, it would have to be international to make it work. That's a formidable challenge.
It is, because you're designing what amounts to an international property regime, right? And as well as imposing some kind of mandatory labeling and trying to then enforce that technologically, because presumably the bad actors, the whole point is the bad actors are trying to mislabel. So that's not easy to do. And it would require a different kind of institution than we have had.
Multi-stakeholders
very
don't want
difficult.
that either.
Somebody's shoe.
It is on the one hand an engineering problem. There you go. It is on the one hand an engineering problem, but also a very difficult problem of designing and operating an institution. And those things are increasingly tied together. You know, Dave talked before about the certificate authority structure and how it was an engineering solution that was incredibly naive about institutional assumptions. And it's just not good enough to do that anymore. We need engineers who can do better.
So let's go to the audience, and again, we start with some students. I'm not afraid, as a professor, to call on folks, but happy to start with volunteers.
Oh, come on.
Come on.
I
I'm
know.
gonna have to cold call somebody.
Par- Oh, we do have a volunteer. Wonderful.
Ooh.
Under the Obama administration, the definition of broadband has somewhat expanded. Should the government adopt a continuously evolving definition of broadband to meet future needs better?
So let me reframe it slightly, which is, how should the government handle the statutory obligation to define advanced, I forget the exact words, telecommunications capability? I don't think it quite uses the word broadband, but what we call broadband. As Larry said, as recently as 2008, it was 1 megabit, now it's 25. How should the government go about doing that?
Can I deconstruct that question? Because embedded it in is an assumption that the government's definition of broadband is, in many circumstances, actually relevant. it is relevant when industry encounters regulation, right? If you're talking about universal service funds and somebody says, well, I'm going to deploy a broadband network and I want to spend government money, then the government has to say, well, okay, but what's broadband? Are you going to build a 2 megabit per second and ask me for my universal service funds? But the question only applies in those narrow sectors, and the FCC is very clear when they said, well, it used to be 1 megabit and it's 4 and it's 25. That only applies in the context of a particular regulatory context. It's not telling the world what broadband ought to be, unless you misunderstand. And there are parts of the world where giving you 10 megabits would be glorious. Okay? And one should never assume that, oh my God, I can't bring 10 megabits to market because it's not 25. If it's better than a 56 KB dial-up modem, that's great in the marketplace. And so I think that the government's not in charge of this stuff. It's you guys who are deciding what product to sell me, and you're under competitive pressure. I've noticed, to my surprise, that twice now Comcast has sent me a note saying, your network just got faster. Well, thank you, sir. But
It was all John.
We appreciate that.
yeah, right. But let me transform. I want to flip it and then get somebody else to speak. I think we're going to go through a transition in how we define broadband. And for marketing reasons, the figure of merit has been, what's the peak speed to my house? But if you look at this video stuff that we're all watching, you know, never mind 4D, and we'll get there in 3D and 4K and virtual reality. A high-resolution Netflix movie today is about 5 megabits a second, right? So if you got 25, why do you need 50? Well, how many kids in your house are watching television simultaneously? Why do you need a gigabit in the house, other than it's a way of putting a sharp stick in the eye of your competitor? The interesting question is, how many gigabytes a month can you watch? And it's the gigabytes that cost you money, because that's what you're actually spending. You know, for you to increase my speed from 25 to 45 megabits a second doesn't actually cost you a lot. But that 40% growth that you're talking about, that's not in peak speed, that's in bytes per month. And that's what's costing you money. And I would just point out that, and my friend here who has a family where you don't watch the same stuff on television caused me to do some arithmetic, which is 300 gigabytes a month is 3 hours a day of HD video, which is 1 hour per occupant in your house, right?
Yep.
That's right. So you're going to need a terabit into your house, and that's going to cost money. And so I'm willing to bet you in 5 years we are defining broadband in terms of how many bytes you can watch, how you can watch bytes, yes, and what are acceptable cost recovery strategies.
Oh, a great prediction. Others of the conference, feel free to come back to it. The future definition of broadband will be on how many bytes per month you consume.
Among other ones.
Among other ones.
Among other parameters.
All right, let's go with another question. Rick?
So following up on that, what, if any, is the responsibility of application creators, application providers, the Internet of Things folks, to create products that don't simply expand to use all available bandwidth a la BitTorrent, and actually are responsible users of bandwidth, recognizing that there are costs to the user?
So I'm just going to offer a slightly different frame, then I'll let Jack go first, which is Dave introduced a great vocabulary. There's coordination challenges, there's incentive challenges, there's trust challenges. He talked about that in security. What Rick has pointed out, that same architecture applies in how bandwidth is used vis-a-vis how application developers interface with the network. Jack, what are your thoughts on that?
I'd say that application providers probably don't care up until the point their product doesn't work. And so there's an incredible tension as a provider of an application of a new thing on the internet to work well. If it doesn't work well, it doesn't matter. If it works well, then clearly you have a success. So I would say it's sort of, and we've seen it time after time after time. An application comes out, it's not very network friendly, it doesn't work well, and the application provider has to tweak. And there are lots of tweaks and tricks, and
Although this is a tricky situation that I think people underestimate, which is often the consumer won't necessarily know whether it's the application or the network that's at fault, and then the application and the network will blame each other.
Sure.
And that's part of the coordination challenge. Ed,
This is what I was going to say, is that one of the fundamental problems here is that the consumer is choosing to use the thing or not, and they often don't really know what are the implications for their bandwidth use, for using up their cap, or congesting the network, their family's network, and so on, from using a particular app or service. So figuring out how we can have more transparency and support better decision making by people, I think would help, because that then generates the incentive for the service or app developer to be more careful about bandwidth use.
I think it's a fantastic question, and you're right. The consumers, and nor should they, kind of know what's happening in the underpinnings. You know, you want it to be simple. You just want it to work. But as people are building product and applications, which I think was the source of the question, there is no incentive today, and it goes a little bit back to what Jack said earlier, and I think there should be. So, you know, let's suppose you were building, you know, a nanny cam at home, and all of a sudden, you know, you just grab the cheapest camera technology you can find. It's a motion JPEG. It spills, you know, 12 megabit stream all the time, whether you're watching it or not, right? And for another 50 cents, right, in the bill of materials, I could have bought a licensed codec that had compression, that had the same video quality, but did it in 4 megabits, and there's no incentive to do that. And and we've looked at this, when you kind of call someone who makes, you know, that camera, and you get a hold of the engineer who built it, and you say, well, it was all about bill of materials, I didn't spend the 50 cents because bandwidth is free. And now I'll go back to where Dave was, that I think the reality is bandwidth gets cheaper all the time. It is a commodity, but it's not free. And one of the things that I think would be important to be, you know, considering is when you look at energy, you know, we have all these star-rated energy appliances and all these things. To the degree there became some, you know, cross multidisciplinary thinking around, you know, providing the best product, but thinking about bandwidth in the context of it's not free, it's available, but we want to make sure we get the right balance of design and capability. And it's, instead of being an energy star, it's more a bandwidth star. I think that would be, you know, something worth the ecosystem collectively considering.
We'll go for, I guess, 2 more questions. Richard and then Dave. I want you guys each ask your question, then we'll pull them together.
So, Richard Bennett. So Casey pointed out that it's hard to know if we're making progress in security because so many attacks are not reported. But there is one place where we clearly are making progress, and that's spam. It wasn't that long ago when 95% of the email that transited the internet was spam, and according to Symantec's report they released last June, we've finally reached the nirvana where less than half of the email. And, you know, and if you want to understand how that happened, you know, look at MOG, because it, you know, it's an organization that pulls together the stakeholders on that very specific problem, among others, and has implemented a solution that involves coordination between essentially every player in the ecosystem. And I know, you know, John and Jack, your people are very actively involved in MOG. So, you know, there's a model there that I think we can learn from.
MOG is great. Yep.
And on the spectrum side, we also can get more spectrum by going to higher frequencies, which is what 5G is all about. So don't ignore that. That's not a question.
That's all right. It's great points, Richard. Thank you.
Great points.
Let's go to Dave.
I just was walking over, that multidisciplinary approach to solving the problem holistically is a big part of why that's successful, and I think it's always been successful in the internet model.
And for those who are not in the acronym world, we'll try to decode for people. Was it MAUD? Was it
MOG.
MOG.
Message Anti-Abuse Working Group.
How many people here have heard of Message Anti-Abuse Working Group before just now? Okay.
M3. Message, mobile, it's anyway.
Yep. So this is a good success story.
Yeah,
in
absolutely.
Multidisciplinary problem solving. That's great to know. I hope someone puts that on the Twitter feed and gives us a
There
good
was
link to
also
that.
some really strong academic research that looked at spam very much from a socio-technical economic perspective and really tried to trace back where the spam is coming from.
And it fed into this group?
Absolutely fed into.
So this is exactly what Dave's calling for, which is smart socio-engineering and ed. Yep. All right, Dave, your last question.
Yeah, so to the point of whether or not bandwidth is a commodity, and let's assume just for a minute that it is, then why would not we treat the infrastructure of broadband as a utility, as has been suggested by the White House, and separate it from the content, and do that across the board, so that the incentives are in the right place. The application providers are incentivized to develop applications and do it in the best way, most efficient way possible, but they're not tied to whether or not you're paying 2 cents per bit or whatever it happens to be. And should there be metering on bandwidth?
So two separate questions there. First one, when you said when suggested by the White House, I was brought back to the Nixon White House, where Tom Whitehead, Dale Hatfield, and others developed a similar suggestion. And the idea would be that you're either in the carriage business or the content business. At times we've had those regulatory regimes. We've moved away from them on the theory that people can be developing efficiencies that come with both. So if people want to talk about that trade-off, and you've obviously seen companies go back and forth on this too.
And countries.
And then your second question is, with bandwidth, does it make sense to meter it and have, I guess, things like data caps, or should you try to provide, I guess, unlimited bandwidth? Dave, since you talked about a little bit of the second one before, do you want to take a whack at either point?
Let me talk about the second one. The first one feels like, yeah, we've had that conversation 27 times, and but let me try the second one. The unlimited bandwidth, the all-you-can-eat, has been a tremendous component of the Internet's success, because when you try an app, you don't know whether you value it and you don't know how much data it sends. And so the economists would call that an experience good. You have to try it to see whether you like it. And if every time you turned on an app you were scared that it was going to chew up your monthly quota, I think this would have been a very chilling effect in that space. So I'm a total fan of the idea that by putting some of the risk onto the infrastructure guys, we absolutely facilitated the consumer's ability to explore this space. In the wireless space, we are now completely accustomed to data caps, and we know that you have to buy tiers. And in response, people are training themselves. They know, do not download a movie until you get to Wi-Fi, and they're learning how to accommodate this. And I think that's because spectrum in the wireless space is fundamentally scarcer than it is in your area, where you can do more. So I think we are going to go to data caps. I'm guessing we're going to go to data caps in the wireline space, but they're going to be they're not going to be burdensome in the same way that the wireless space is so heavily constraining the consumers. But I think a little bit of constraint in that, a little bit of discipline in that space is probably a good idea. But that's a very heretical thing I just said, because some people are religiously attached to the all-you-can-eat paradigm as the only acceptable wireline paradigm. They know, unless you're a company that has no market share so you can afford to sell unlimited wireless service, that you're not going to get unlimited wireless service.
I'd argue that the notion of the unlimited all-you-can-eat really has never existed. Even in the wireline business, you buy a port, and the port has so much capacity. And if you need more, you buy another port. So in some way, we've always had some physical cap for bandwidth consumption in the system. And that's been true for at least my
But for the consumer experience, you are making some very strong probabilistic assumptions about the fact that if you give them a 25 megabit service, they don't run 25 megabits all the time. In fact, your business would be unsustainable if all of
He's got the consumer business. So
I'm sorry, I'm looking at him.
Well, I got business too, Jack.
For you, for you, this is completely true. It was a very consumer-facing comment that I just made.
Well, I mean, just one quick comment, because I think you're winding down here, is I think in the space of this question, I mean, for the foreseeable future and certainly over history, there continues to be a need for sustainable investment, for sustainable innovation to hit these growth curves. So there's a lot that goes into, growing from an original broadband pipe, to 25 megabits, to 505 megabits, to a gig to the home. So, this is the kind of thing where a sustainable model of investment and a sustainable model of technology is applied to keep bringing these greater speeds at a lower unit cost to consumers or businesses.
And I think the answer to the utility question is what sustainable model of investment does it give you?
This topic will come back during the course of the conference, sustainable investment models and regulatory and antitrust oversight, as well as IP rights. So you have helped to set us up with a fabulous discussion. Let's thank all our panelists, and please join us for a break.